In the winter of 1799, a 70-year-old man was leading 20,000 soldiers across the Alps in conditions that military historians still struggle to fully describe. No roads, temperatures below freezing, mountain passes so narrow that soldiers had to move in single file while the wind tried to pull them off the cliffs. The French had destroyed the only bridge across the Reuss River at Devil's Bridge Gorge, leaving a gap over a chasm that dropped several hundred feet to white water below. The Russian soldiers pulled apart a nearby wooden barn, tied the planks together with their own officers' sashes, and built a replacement bridge while French troops fired at them from the far bank. The old man watching this was Alexander Suvorov, the most decorated soldier in Russian history, a general who had fought in 11 major wars, commanded in more than 60 battles, and never once walked off a battlefield on the losing side. He had been recalled from retirement for this campaign, specifically because nobody else could do what needed doing. He was small, thin, frequently ill, and had a habit of conducting inspections in his nightshirt. His soldiers worshipped him with the particular devotion that men reserve for commanders who keep them alive. He crossed the Alps. He lost a significant portion of his army to cold, starvation, and French ambushes. He arrived on the other side having achieved nothing strategically, the campaign he had been sent to complete having already collapsed through the failures of his Austrian allies. He had been maneuvered into an impossible position by incompetent coalition partners and had fought his way out through sheer military skill. He asked to go home. The Tsar made him a field marshal, the highest rank in the Russian army. Then Suvorov died 4 months later, worn out by everything. That is the end of the story. The beginning is more interesting. Alexander Suvorov was born in Moscow in 1729 into a minor noble family with military connections. His father was a general, which meant young Alexander grew up around soldiers and understood from childhood that military service was both his destiny and his primary path to anything resembling significance. He was a sickly child, thin and frequently ill, and his father at one point apparently concluded that the boy was not physically suited for a military career and should pursue something else. Suvorov's response to this assessment shaped everything that followed. He began a systematic program of physical hardening that he would continue for the rest of his life. Cold baths in winter, long runs in whatever weather was available, sleeping without a blanket regardless of temperature, eating sparingly. He was not trying to become strong in the conventional sense. He was trying to become indifferent to physical discomfort, to train his body to function effectively under conditions that would incapacitate men who had not prepared themselves the same way. By the time he enlisted at 17, he had turned the frail child his father had worried about into something considerably more durable. His early military career was undistinguished in the way that early military careers tend to be for men who have not yet found a war large enough to display what they can do. He served as a junior officer, learned logistics, learned how to manage soldiers, and read. He read everything he could find about military history, about the campaigns of Caesar and Turenne and Marlborough, about ancient sieges and modern tactics. He developed opinions that differed sharply from the conventional wisdom of 18th century European military theory, and he kept those opinions to himself until he had the rank and the results to make them stick. The 7 Years' War gave him his first real combat. He fought against Prussia, which meant fighting against the army of Frederick the Great, arguably the finest military machine in Europe at the time. What Suvorov observed in those campaigns, fighting against Prussian forces and alongside Russian ones, confirmed the theories he had been developing. The Prussian army's famous discipline was real, but it was the discipline of a machine, relying on drill and parade ground precision that broke down under the kind of rapid, aggressive, unexpected action that Suvorov was beginning to believe was the key to military success. His central idea was simple, and the Russian military establishment found it deeply uncomfortable. Speed and aggression beat everything else. Not preparation, not caution, not the elaborate positional maneuvering that dominated 18th century European warfare. You hit first, you hit hard, you kept moving before the enemy could recover. He had a phrase for it. The bullet is a fool, the bayonet is a fine fellow. He meant that aimed fire from stationary positions was slow and uncertain, while a charging soldier with a bayonet closed the distance fast enough to make the enemy's shooting irrelevant. The idea was not original to Suvorov. What was original was how consistently and how effectively he applied it. His first independent command came in 1763, when he was assigned to suppress a Polish uprising. He was 34 years old and had never commanded more than a small detachment. He ended the campaign in weeks, moving so fast that the Polish forces never had time to consolidate, and returned to his superiors with a reputation for speed and effectiveness that would define how the Russian army thought about him for the rest of his career. The most revealing thing about Suvorov as a commander is not any of his battles. It is what he did between battles. Most 18th century European commanders treated their soldiers as instruments to be deployed rather than as men to be developed. The Prussian model, which everyone else was trying to imitate, emphasized drill, obedience, and uniformity. Soldiers were trained to stand in lines, follow commands, and maintain formation under fire. Individual initiative was not encouraged because individual initiative in a linear battle formation meant men stepping out of line and disrupting the geometry that made the system work. Suvorov trained his soldiers completely differently. He wanted them to think. He wanted them to understand what was happening in a battle, well enough to act correctly when orders couldn't reach them, when the formation had dissolved in the chaos of close combat, when the situation had changed so fast that waiting for instructions was the same as dying. He wrote a military training manual called The Science of Victory, which was unusual in Russian military literature for being written in plain language that ordinary soldiers could understand. He wanted the soldiers to read it, not just the officers. He trained for the specific conditions of combat rather than for the parade ground. Night marches, river crossings under simulated fire, rapid assaults on prepared positions. He pushed his soldiers harder in training than most commanders pushed theirs in battle, on the explicit theory that men who had learned to function at the edge of their capacity in training would still be functional when battle pushed them beyond what they thought they could do. He had a saying that his soldiers knew by heart: train hard, fight easy. He also had an unusual relationship with his enlisted men for a Russian noble of the 18th century. He knew their names. He ate the same food they ate. He slept in the same conditions they slept in. When he inspected troops, he asked soldiers questions about their equipment and their training, and he knew enough about both to recognize whether the answers were genuine or rehearsed for his benefit. Soldiers who gave him honest assessments of problems were rewarded. Officers who presented a false picture were not. This was not sentimentality. It was a practical calculation about information. A commander who is surrounded by people telling him what he wants to hear makes decisions based on a reality that doesn't exist. Suvorov wanted accurate information because accurate information was what battles were won on, and creating an environment where accurate information could flow up the chain of command required treating the people at the bottom of that chain as worth listening to. By the standards of the Russian army of his era, this was close to revolutionary. His soldiers called him Father Suvorov and followed him into positions that any rational military calculus would have said were impossible. This was not purely the result of affection. It was the result of a track record. Soldiers who had served under Suvorov had a habit of surviving battles that looked unsurvivable because he had the tactical instinct to find the angle of attack or the moment of assault that converted a defender's apparent advantage into a liability. After enough battles, his soldiers believed that if Suvorov said it was possible, even when it looked like he was wrong. He almost never was. On December 22nd, 1790, Suvorov's army stormed a fortress that 3 previous Russian commanders had decided could not be taken by assault. Izmail sat on the Danube River in what is now Ukraine, a Turkish fortress that had been built and improved with French engineering assistance specifically to resist the kind of siege that Russian armies typically conducted. The walls were between 6 and 10 meters high, fronted by a wide ditch 10 meters deep. The garrison numbered around 35,000 men, more than the attacking Russian force, well supplied and commanded by officers who had been told the fortress was impregnable. 3 Russian generals had looked at Izmail and concluded the assessment was correct. They had pulled back from the siege, reported the fortress too strong to take, and waited for someone else to make the decision. Catherine the Great sent Suvorov. He arrived in late November with an army of around 30,000 men and immediately began doing something that no previous commander had done, building a full-scale replica of the fortress walls outside the Russian camp. He spent 2 weeks running his soldiers through practice assaults on the replica, drilling the specific movements required to cross the ditch, scale the walls, and fight in the confined spaces of a fortress that had never been breached. He worked out the timing, the sequence of attacks, the coordination between different columns. He did this in the open, in full view of Turkish scouts who reported back to the garrison. Whether this was oversight or deliberate psychological warfare is not recorded. He sent a message to the Turkish commander demanding surrender. The response was polite and firm. Izmail would not surrender. Suvorov replied that he had no choice but to storm the fortress and that the consequences of a successful assault would be unfortunate for the garrison. He then gave his officers 3 days' notice and addressed his troops with a speech that his soldiers would repeat for the rest of their lives. Twice Russia has stood before Izmail, and twice retreated. Now there shall be no retreat. We shall take Izmail or die. The assault began at dawn on December 22nd. 9 columns attacked simultaneously from different directions, coordinated so that the garrison could not concentrate its defense at any single point. The ditch was crossed under fire. The walls were scaled with ladders while defenders tried to push them away. The fighting on the walls and then inside the fortress lasted for hours, the kind of close-quarters combat where the training Suvorov had conducted on the replica paid its dividends most clearly. Soldiers who knew exactly what to do in the confined spaces of the fortifications did it without waiting for orders. By noon, Izmail was taken. Approximately 26,000 of the 35,000-man garrison were dead. Russian losses were around 4,000 killed and 6,000 wounded. The fortress that 3 commanders had declared impregnable had fallen in 6 hours. Suvorov wrote his official report to Catherine in a verse epigram that became famous in Russia. "Glory to God, glory to you, Izmail is taken." Catherine was reportedly amused and impressed in equal measure. Suvorov was given honors and a modest financial reward. He was not given the military promotion he had expected, partly because Catherine's court favorites felt threatened by his growing reputation, and partly because Suvorov had a well-established talent for making powerful people uncomfortable. Suvorov's relationship with the Russian court and the Russian military establishment was the central frustration of his professional life, and the key to understanding why a general who never lost a battle spent significant portions of his career in forced retirement or semi-exile. He was difficult. This is the diplomatic version. The more accurate version is that he had no patience for the political performance that military rank in an imperial court required. He said what he thought in the presence of people who were not accustomed to being told what anyone actually thought, and he had a specific and well-documented contempt for the kind of parade ground soldiering that looked impressive and had no relationship to what armies needed to do in actual combat. Catherine's court favorite, Prince Potemkin, was both Suvorov's patron and his primary obstacle for the middle portion of his career. Potemkin had genuine military talent and was smart enough to recognize Suvorov's value. He used him, gave him commands that produced the victories the Russian state needed, and then managed the credit carefully to ensure that the political benefits flowed in the right directions. Suvorov understood the arrangement and found it tolerable as long as he was given real commands. When he wasn't given real commands, he sent letters to the court that were technically respectful and comprehensively devastating about the military incompetence of whoever had been given the command instead. Paul I, who became Tsar in 1796 after Catherine's death, was a passionate admirer of Prussian military methods and spent the early portion of his reign attempting to reform the Russian army along Prussian lines. Suvorov's response to the Prussian reforms was delivered at a military review when he watched the newly Prussianized troops perform their parade ground drill and said, loudly enough to be heard by the officers conducting the review, "Powder is not gunpowder. Curls are not cannons. A pigtail is not a saber." He was referring to the Prussian fashion for powdering soldiers' hair, curling it at the sides and wearing it in a braided pigtail, all of which consumed soldiers' time and had no military value whatsoever. Paul I exiled him to his country estate. This is where the story turns on itself in a way that reveals something important about what Suvorov actually meant to the Russian state. In 1799, the War of the Second Coalition brought France into conflict with most of Europe. French armies under Napoleon's generals were advancing in Italy and threatening to push through Switzerland into the Austrian heartland. The coalition partners, Austria and Britain, needed someone to command the Allied forces in Italy. The Austrians specifically requested Suvorov. Paul I, who had exiled Suvorov less than 2 years earlier for insulting his military reforms, recalled him, gave him command of the Allied forces, and sent him to Italy. Suvorov was 69 years old. He had been living on his country estate doing nothing that resembled military preparation. He arrived in Italy in April 1799 and proceeded to win 6 major engagements in the space of 3 months, driving the French out of most of northern Italy with a speed that contemporary observers compared to a natural disaster rather than a military campaign. The Austrians, who were nominally his partners, spent most of this period being confused by how fast he was moving and periodically attempting to slow him down to coordinate strategy. Suvorov moved without waiting for the coordination. The Swiss campaign of autumn 1799 was the operation that made Suvorov legendary in Western Europe rather than just in Russia, and it was a military disaster that somehow became a military masterpiece at the same time. The plan, developed by the Austrian High Command without Suvorov's input and communicated to him after it was already in motion, required his army to cross the Alps into Switzerland, where a Russian force under General Rimsky-Korsakov was waiting to link up with him. Together, they would destroy the French forces in Switzerland and secure the coalition's northern flank. Suvorov pointed out several problems with the plan. The Austrians had promised him mules and supplies at Bellinzona, the starting point for the Alpine crossing. He arrived at Bellinzona and found neither mules nor supplies. He also found that Rimsky-Korsakov had already been defeated by the French at the Second Battle of Zurich and was no longer in a position to link up with anyone. He was in Switzerland with 20,000 soldiers, no supplies, no mules, no Allied forces to link up with, and winter arriving. The French had blocked the mountain passes ahead of him. Behind him were more French forces. The logical military conclusion was that his army was trapped and would need to surrender or be destroyed attempting to break out. Suvorov's response to this situation was to call a council of war, describe the situation accurately to his officers, and then announce that they were going to fight their way out through the passes rather than surrender. His officers had served under him long enough to accept this assessment without significant debate. He had told them impossible things before and been right. What followed over the next 3 weeks is one of the more extraordinary episodes in European military history. The Russian army crossed 3 Alpine passes in autumn conditions, fighting French forces at each one, losing soldiers to combat in cold and mountain terrain in approximately equal measure. At Devil's Bridge, where the French had destroyed the crossing, the soldiers dismantled a barn and built a replacement under fire. At the Pragal Pass, soldiers descended a mountain face so steep that horses fell to their deaths and men survived only by using their weapons as brakes. The baggage was lost. The artillery was lost. The food ran out and soldiers ate what they could find in mountain villages that had almost nothing to give. He got them out. Around 15,000 of the 20,000 who had started the crossing made it through to the Rhine Valley. The French, who had expected to destroy or capture the Russian force in the mountains, had instead watched it fight through everything they put in front of it and emerge on the other side still functional as a military unit. Suvorov had lost a quarter of his army. He had won every engagement he fought. The campaign he had been sent to accomplish had failed because of Austrian incompetence and poor coalition coordination. By the strict logic of strategic outcomes, it was a failure. By every other measure, it was the most impressive thing he had ever done. Suvorov returned to Russia in 1800, expecting the kind of welcome that a general receives when he has performed impossibly well in impossible circumstances. What he received was silence. Paul I, who had changed his mind about Suvorov approximately 3 times in the preceding 4 years, was in one of his cold phases. There was no honor guard at the city gate, no official ceremony. Suvorov arrived in St. Petersburg and found that the court had decided, for reasons connected to Austrian diplomatic complaints about his conduct of the campaign, that the appropriate response to the Swiss expedition was not celebration. He died 6 weeks later, on May 18, 1800, from illness brought on by the Alpine campaign and the Russian winter. He was 70 years old. The Tsar did not attend the funeral. The record he left behind is straightforward to state and almost impossible to explain. 63 significant engagements over a career spanning 4 decades. No defeats, not one. Against Turks, against Poles, against French armies commanded by some of the best generals of the revolutionary period, against fortresses, in open field battles, in mountain terrain that military theory said was impassable. He won all of them. The explanations that military historians offer for this record tend to cluster around the same factors. He was faster than his opponents, always. The speed of his marches, the speed of his decision-making, the speed with which his soldiers could execute orders consistently put him in positions where the enemy was reacting to him rather than the reverse. He was aggressive to a degree that opponents found disorienting. 18th century military convention involved elaborate positional maneuvering designed to gain tactical advantages before committing to battle. Suvorov committed to battle before the maneuvering was finished, accepting positional disadvantages in exchange for the initiative that early action provided. He was also right, more often than any general, has a right to be about the specific tactical questions that decided battles. Where to hit, when to hit, which point in the enemy's line was weaker than it looked, which apparent strength was actually a vulnerability. This kind of tactical judgment is the hardest thing to teach and the hardest thing to explain after the fact, because the factors that went into it were partly experience, partly analysis, and partly something that the people who watched him work called instinct, but probably reflected a depth of pattern recognition that came from decades of studying and fighting battles. Napoleon, who had his own opinions about generalship and was not usually generous in assessing competitors, was asked about Suvorov after the Italian and Swiss campaigns of 1799 and said that among all the commanders he had knowledge of, Suvorov was the one he would have most wanted to fight alongside and most feared fighting against. The compliment was genuine, and the reasoning was simple. Suvorov did the thing that Napoleon himself believed was the essential quality of a great commander, which was to make rapid decisions under uncertainty and act on them before the uncertainty resolved itself. The Russian military remembered Suvorov the way militaries tend to remember commanders who are too useful to ignore and too difficult to manage. His methods were studied, his writings were taught, his campaigns were analyzed in staff colleges for a century after his death. When Russia needed someone to explain to young officers what military excellence actually looked like, they used Suvorov as the example. When they needed someone to model institutional behavior on, they used someone more compliant. He trained hard so his men could fight easy. He hit first because hitting second meant reacting. He told his soldiers the truth about dangerous situations because soldiers who know the truth can be trusted to act correctly, while soldiers who have been misled cannot. He won 63 battles over 4 decades and never found a combination of geography, enemy strength, and bad circumstances that he couldn't fight through. That was Suvorov's whole point. He always pushed ahead, and nothing could stop him.